Hey, how are you? You ready? You guys fired up? There's a bunch of you just coming in now. There's a whole. Uh, Now I didn't know how many Baptists were here. There's a whole front row that's empty. So there's got to be several Baptists that are with us. There's a whole front row if you want to sit. Some people have offered for you to sit in their lap for $10 extra. Uh, Thank you. Look at that modeling. That's exactly right. Again, my name's Chap Clark, and I am. I got this kind of weird job where my responsibility, working for a school called Fuller Theological Seminary. It's the largest accredited seminary in the world. Our main campus is in Pasadena, California, but we've got 7 different campuses in different parts of the country, and now a new one opening up in Atlanta. And I've been part of the Fuller Texas ever since the beginning, almost 4 or 5 years ago, where a group of people decided that it was time to have a group of people come together to train pastors, counselors, youth workers, a whole bunch of different folks in what does it mean to know and love Jesus Christ, to follow the historic Christian faith, and also engage in the world that God so deeply loves. And that's Fuller's mission. So if you guys know anybody that's thinking of seminary, or if some of you might actually be believers, that means, of course, that you probably, it might be fun to take a class or two. You have till November 20th to sign up, take 1 or 2 classes. Our academic dean here is Andy Dearman. He was one of the leading Old Testament people in the whole world, and he's the guy kind of academically leading Fuller, Texas. Great group of folks, and Brian's going to be back there. I just have to give that kind of little pitch. And the folks at this church have worked so hard, and Luke mentioned everybody else but them. So give the big hand to the folks at this church that have put this on. And I got to tell you, there's folks from this church, but there's also folks from a whole lot of other churches. So if you're from a different church, would you raise your hand? Any different church, including your own. Okay, it's kind of different. Oh, that's great. Glad that you're here. This isn't about me. It's about us. It's about a world that's changing so dramatically. And so a lot of folks have this idea that when we talk about teenagers, when we talk about kids, if they've actually never been around them, worked with them, or been a parent of teenagers, they may stand aloof and aside and say, oh, come on, a teenager is a teenager is a teenager. There's just certain principles that you have to do, just kind of apply important things. Just tell a kid until you're 18, you do exactly what I say. Some of you parents know that works really well. And they may think that it's just really a lot easier than it is. But, how many of you, your oldest child is 13 or younger? Raise your hand. Oh, a bunch of you. That's so encouraging. I just have to tell you, since you came tonight, you're going to be fine. You're going to have no problem. Your kids are going to do great. They're all going to love Jesus and be Texan fans. Okay? And they probably will never go to a school in Alabama. So that's really an important thing. How many of you, your oldest child is 18 or older? Raise your hand if you're still able to. Okay, good. Do not tell them I completely lied to them that they're really in for it. Okay, don't let them know what it's really like to have that 16-year-old say things to you that should only be repeated at a church board meeting. Those are some of the things we want to actually avoid. So as we get going, really being a parent today is actually less about kind of the rules and what to do. It's really kind of like herding cats.
They can herd cattle, holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs. Well, that's another thing altogether.
Being a cat herder is probably about the toughest thing I think I've ever done.
I got this one this morning, right here. And if you look at his face, it's just ripped to shreds, You
see the movies, you hear the stories. I'm living a dream. Not everyone can do what we do.
I wouldn't do nothing else.
It ain't an easy job, but when you bring a herd into town and you ain't lost a one of them, ain't a feeling like it in the world.
That is essentially what we're doing. It is every child represented in this room and by people you know and people you do not know, every kid in the greater Houston area, every kid in Texas, around the rest of the United States, every kid around the world has their own unique history, their own unique story, and in a world that's changing and fragmenting, what Thomas Friedman calls the atomization of society, where we're really just becoming these isolated atoms rubbing and scraping and bumping into one another. As kids grow up, it is more and more difficult for them to figure out how to actually navigate this thing we call adolescence and moving into adulthood than it's ever been before. Now, I'm going to try to convince you of that while we're here together. Is we're going to start off with kind of getting a level playing field, so we're all using the same kind of language, moving into what culture's done to kids and how it's changed development. And then we're going to talk about what we actually do about it. I'm going to be speaking mostly for parents. Sorry. Something just kind of came up. Ready? Okay. Come back. Yes. In order to get us going, I just want to acknowledge that, preparing our kids for adulthood really starts young. Whether it is you want your kid to be prepared for the risks of life, so you really want to get them ready, or perhaps you want to help your kid to be more culturally relevant, or perhaps to prepare your kids for healthy dating relationships. It starts young. And, even when they're little tiny kids, we prepare them for the adult world they're about to live in. Take a look at this. Okay, that's plenty. That's probably enough. Okay, that's good. I don't know how you actually feel about this, but if you're like me, and I know I am, I think that works. I watched something like this, and you go to almost any mid-sized or large town across the country, and almost every single weekend during the school year, whether it's dance or cheer competitions, you're going to see very young girls. And I'm already realizing that maybe some of us here, we are steeped in this ourselves, and some of the things we're going to be talking about may be kind of difficult for us. But I just want to give you my perspective is all you know about me so far is, I'm attractive. That's really all you got to go on. But I've spent a lifetime, 15 years on the Young Life staff, primarily in California and in Colorado. And then I've been actually teaching graduate school for about 20 years. And during that time, attempting to try to understand more and more what's going on in culture, what's happening to children, families, marriage, and as they grow up, young adults and adults, we recognize is things are changing right before our eyes and we barely notice it. I don't know how you feel about this, but if you actually think about 8 and 9-year-old girls doing these kind of moves, it's like maybe some of us ought to kind of get in a helicopter and go 1,000 feet and look down and take a kind of a macro analysis, because to me, this should not happen. These little tiny kids, in fact, these kind of moves, that shouldn't even happen until you've been married 10 years, you have 2 kids, you go to Hawaii on your anniversary, you say, honey, I've been practicing. Then it's okay. Woohoo! Go for it. But when you're 8, 9, 10 years old, to earn a trophy for your dance coach by presenting moves and a body that is primarily focused on being a sexual object, that affects kids. And the world's changed dramatically. And that's the kind of thing we're going to be talking about, is a conversation for parents and other caring adults. I realize not everyone here is here because you're actually a parent of a teenager. If you're a parent of a child coming up, it's partly to get you ready for what's going on and give you some tips on how to be thinking about it. Some of you, your kids are a little bit older. You're going to see that adolescence does seem to extend further into adulthood than it ever did before. But actually, in every culture around the globe, and this is where we're going to start, kind of the overall process, in every culture around the globe, for all of time, there were 2 stages of life. You either were a child or you were an adult. Every child belonged to every adult in their society in its original stages. It wasn't just parents that raised kids. It was the community at large that saw every children belonging to every adult. Why? Because the point of life was to wake up in the morning and to sing and to laugh and to tell your stories. It's called your meta-narrative. Narrative is a summation of events that you build a boundary around to describe it and meaning to it. We all have our narratives. A meta-narrative is when we share these stories together and then we wake up in the morning and life is about experiencing the life we have together. Therefore, kids were the most precious asset of every culture. because they passed on your story. They mattered. They were not somebody you would somehow from on high or from a distant perspective hand data to, throw heavy expectations upon. No, it's in every culture around the globe for all time, you'd surround every child so they knew that they were safe and they were cared for and they mattered and they had a voice. And as they grew up in their uniqueness, what scholars would call differentiation, their own unique person was celebrated in the context of that community and society. Therefore, even up till less than 100 years ago, nobody ever talked about discovering your identity. You didn't have to figure that out because the community kind of handled that for you. Then, for a lot of reasons over time, that's still up for debate in some circles, we finally recognized about late 1800s, 1880s or so, up till about 1910, a massive shift occurred. And we're not going to have time tonight. We've only got, this is going to be over tonight at 11, okay? The first section, then we're going to do a junior high lock-in from 11:30 to 4, okay? We're going to watch video games and make out in the corner, okay? The interesting thing is we don't have time to unpack all of this, but the reality is the largest shift ever in human development occurred that was coming for a long time, like a little tiny snowball at the top of a Colorado mountain. It had been building for maybe centuries, but ultimately we got to late 1800s, early 1900s. We realized we'd paid a price. Something had shifted. No longer were kids our most precious asset. Our children could not really contribute to our own desire to make sense out of life, because the basic idea of living your life was not about dancing and singing and telling your collective stories and your meta-narrative. The point of life was to wake up in the morning and beat your neighbor at something. The ethic of competition is the meaning of life. It was not just the nation states in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. It was also the rise of the middle class, where the primary ethic was to make sure that I had enough success and I made my mark, and therefore I felt good about myself. And therefore, children could not contribute to that. And we paid a price. There was a loss of what had been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years across all cultures. And the loss is what scholars call, two fancy words, social capital. Capital, that's where you have resources. Social capital, you have people resources in your life. Scholars have known for a long time, you cannot grow up, you cannot become an adult unless you have a bunch of adults in your life. You can't. You can't become a healthy, productive, interdependent person in society unless you have had adults train you, surround you, speak into your life, but also hold you and train you through both modeling and listening. And that's what we had lost, and that's what this word is. Scholars gave this word to a new stage of life, brand new, identified late 1800s, early 1900s, that it comes out of the Latin adolescere. Adolescence was a new stage of life. You were no longer a child where you're dependent on your family system for your sense of self. And you weren't yet an adult. You didn't really necessarily fit. What really happened? Definition of this term? What happened is kids were now on their own to become adults. For all of time, in every culture, a child would grow up in the context of this amazing community that holistically surrounded them. So as they moved from childhood and they entered into adulthood, that actually the brain shifts from about 14 or 15 from childlike concreteness to the adult ability of abstraction. That happened about 14 or 15. And then historically, the body shifted. Puberty, on average, was right about the same time, 14 or 15. So you were a child, right about 14 or 15, you moved into this thing called adulthood, and the community partnered with you as you became an adult. But adolescence said, kid, basically, we're going to help you, but you're on your own to enter adulthood. That's the shift. That's why we say to kids, what are you going to major in? Where are you going to go to school? What activities are you going to do? You're not living up to one of the worst words we can use with kids, potential. It's almost impossible to define. All it is a bar that our kids almost never can reach. But that's basically what adolescence is. It's this middle ground where you've got to figure out how you are going to uniquely insert yourself into adulthood. That's basically the history. I'm not going to use whole bunch of big words. I'm tenured. I don't have to pretend I know them anymore. But individuation is a word that is used by almost everybody except for Carl Jung and Jung's followers. Maybe you've heard of him. Philosopher, theologian, psychologist. Every time I say Jung, I kind of crack up. He also played right field for the Mets for a while. He sold women's shoes in Manhattan, Nordstrom's. Really a well-known guy, kind of eclectic. But he uses this word individuation. Take off the T-I-O-N and just put an L there. The process of becoming a unique individual. That's what adolescence is. It's where you figure out that I'm a unique person and then you insert yourself in adult society. To Jung, individuation didn't even happen to your late 30s, early 40s. Because in your 20s and 30s, you're working so hard to build your house of cards. You want to make sure you're successful and figure out who you are and how you're going to impact the world. And then you eventually hit somewhere around late 30s, early 40s, maybe into 50. And you try to figure out what Richard Rohr calls the second. It's the filling, the second stage of life. And that's essentially how Jung used it. But everybody else, almost in psychology, uses this term, individuation, to describe the process of becoming a unique person. There's basically three parts to this. And this is the most kind of lecture-ish stuff I'm going to do. Most of this will be fun and incredibly depressing. That's what's so cool about this tonight. Thank you for coming. Just want to share that with you. There are three tasks. I just got to get this on, and even as we say them, you guys, you're going to go, wow, that's kind of complicated. But pretty soon, it'll become part of your vocabulary. Here's the first. The quest for identity. In secular psychology, which is actually my academic background, is this idea that identity is something you form into, identity formation. Maybe you've heard of James Marcia or Bristol Palin, some of the people that have really worked hard at some of these kind of things. I love political jokes in Texas. They're always incredibly risky. I think that's so fun. Dancing with the what? Okay, sorry. Anyway, identity is talked about as identity formation, where you actually choose and make decisions that help you to form into the person that you choose yourself to become. And there's a lot of pieces to this. There's a lot of disagreement. It's not that clean. It's mostly theoretical. But I'm what's called a practical theologian. Now, I realize that sounds like an oxymoron. I have theology degree stuff, kind of a secular PhD work, and Fuller Seminary, where I am also a professor as well as an administrator, I'm a practical theologian. And you go, that's an oxymoron. You know what oxymoron is. You know, jumbo shrimp, right? Oakland Raiders commitment to excellence, that would be an oxymoron. Okay, you got the idea. We're words together that really don't belong together. Practical theology fits with that. But practical theology says this: how do I understand who God is and who He has revealed Himself to be? Who are we in response to that, and how does that actually work in the real world? That's practical theology. So theologically, identity, and there's actually secular social science developmentalists that have acknowledged this, is there is a longing, an ache in the human person that wants to somehow access the inner self. Freud even talked about this. And a lot of psychoanalytic theory grudgingly has to accept that there's this sense of self that's buried deep within each person. Well, when you look at your child growing up, one of the three tasks of individuation is to somehow come to grips with, who am I uniquely? This is where differentiation comes into play. Who am I as distinct from others? And it's an interesting process, and here's kind of a fancy word, but it takes two different concepts that have now become one word in your spell check. They weren't 15 years ago. Psychologically, I ask the question constantly as I grow up, who am I? And then sociologically, I'm constantly having to deal with the messages I receive that would answer that question. So the process is, and here's the fancy idea of it, but this is so important for you guys to get and us to understand as we talk about human development. It's a psychosocial process, one word, where I am constantly asking the question, who do I perceive myself to be, while I'm interpreting messages that tell me who I'm supposed to be, and this constant interplay is psychosocial. And you can't be an adult until you ultimately land on, and I would say theologically, discover who you are. identity discovery is much more intrinsic to the human person. Your kid, as they grow up, wants to figure out what is unique about me. Do people value me? Do I sense my identity because I'm good at something? Am I loved and cherished and celebrated because I can kick a soccer ball, or I get good grades, or can play a musical instrument? In other words, is my identity rooted in what I do, as Henry Nouwen says in his book, In the Name of Jesus? Is it rooted in what I do, what I control, and what others say about me? Those are all externals. But see, your kid has this process going on in individuation where they got to come to grips with that. In fact, you can't become an adult until you land and settle. This is who I am. Identity. Secondly, this is an interesting one because most people think in terms of responsibility on this one, because every parent wants your kid to be responsible, right? In fact, most moms, this is where moms are just awesome. You say, I love you about 400 times a day. That's great. Good for you. And that's good, especially if you mean it. But then when kids leave the house, two things most moms will say, besides I love you, it's be yourself and make good choices, right? And kids, by the time your kids hits abstraction, they're 14 or 15, when you're saying that and they're in 5th grade or they're in 7th grade, they look at you and go, okay, and they just goes right over their head. They get about 16, 17, and then sometimes they kind of turn around and just look at you. You have no idea what you were talking. Be yourself. Which self do you want me to be? Do you want me to be the animal on the football field? Do you want me to be the racist at lunch? Do you want me to be the really nice kid at English because I like my English teacher? She's hot. Or do you want me to be the kind of obnoxious kid in math because I hate that teacher and those kids are idiots? Which self are we referring to, Mom? And make good choices. Every kid knows by the time they're about 14 or 15, we don't mean that. Come on. We don't really mean for them to make choices. We mean for them to make the choices that will keep the assistant principal or sheriff's office from calling us. Make the kind of choices that will not cause a hassle for our family, honey. Be responsible. Make good choices. And we dare not let them read our high school yearbooks. But what's interesting about this whole idea of autonomy, and this is actually you'll read magazines and newspapers, it'll be on TV and on news reports, is we talk about how kids today lack responsibility. Well, here's the problem. Autonomy as a developmental process is not making good choices. Autonomy is what's the source of those choices you're making. In other words, if you are training your kid to make the kind of choices that teachers, coaches, and we ourselves as parents force them to make by squeezing them so tightly, you're either an at-risk bad kid or you're a good kid. There's very little room between those two. As long as you're making the choices that we all tell you to make, awesome, you're responsible. The problem with that is it's not individuation. You delay your own human development because you haven't learned how to navigate the complexity of life. And autonomy is more about the internal process of making choices that come from within, not simply respond to what comes from without. Does that make sense to you guys? Autonomy is the locus of control. It's a sense of voice. In fact, the better word to understand autonomy is this idea of power. Now, especially as Christians, I get it. It's hard to believe this, I realize, because I'm only 37, but our kids are 31, 27, and 24. I go, by every other year. That's how I have solved that one. But what's interesting about this idea, I've been raised on all the books by Christian famous people, some of whom read journal articles 30 or 40 years ago. It seems to me to be relatively fact, is that we rarely in Christendom, in our books and our speaking and our preaching, actually look at data carefully and have the training to go into it deeply and to connect that to what God actually says about things. But one of our deals is that what most of us have grown up with is the last thing and what you want to do to your kid is give them power. We really want to say, as long as you live under my roof, we may say it with a smile and holding a cross or a Bible with wheels. There's some Baptists here. I just want to affirm. Okay. The interesting thing about that is that the last thing we want to give our kids is power. No. In fact, this whole movement of authority has jumped into the church out of nowhere. It's not in Scripture hardly at all in terms of human relationships. To teach our kids to respect authority, sure. The concept of respect is incredibly important, but it is a subset way down the list from them developing their own sense of self and power. It's like when you tell your kids, till you're 18, you got to do what I say. Tattoo artists love that. Have you ever tested that one out? Some of you, as your kids get older, you realize that the second the kid, you tell them that when they're 11, they remember that stuff, okay? Honey, love you. You're going to get to do that when you're 18 because you'll be an adult because we have this number, 18. And then all of a sudden they turn, 2 days for their 18th birthday and they make the tattoo appointment. And they're not going to tell you because they're an adult. They can make their own choices because you've told them that their whole life. You didn't actually mean it when they actually turned 17. And then what do? They go to the tattoo parlor and they get a tattoo that just, depending on your denomination, might be a little crazy. A huge Zelda right across their chest. And come home, hey, do you like it? That's awesome. And boys also get tattoos. So this is a serious thing. And lastly, belonging. See, part of individuation is where you believe that somebody cares without an external agenda. You believe that somebody cares about you no matter what grade you get, whether you cleaned your room, whether or not you got a ticket driving, how you behave, how you talk, how you dress. In other words, that there's a sense that you're part of a community. These three: identity, who am I? Autonomy, do I have any power? Do I have any voice? Does my voice matter? Belonging, does anybody ultimately care? Until you answer these three, you cannot be an adult. Because every relationship, until you relatively land, you're not going to ever settle on them completely. We all know that as adults. But until you relatively land, every relationship you have will be tools in order to solve these issues inside. That's why we call it adolescence. You're still an adolescent when you're on this journey. You become an adult when you've relatively landed and settled, when you're trustworthy with your neediness and your sense of voice, when you actually can connect with others. And that's what's kind of interesting about his whole process. Every time you get in a fight with a teenager or a young adult, every time, it will have something to do with one or usually the integration of all three of these things. Think of the last time you got in a fight or an emotional conversation. That's for the dads. We don't fight. We just absolutely scream at each other. Okay, that's good. There you go. Healthy. It's related to this. Somehow, we're getting in the way of their trying to figure this stuff out. By the way, this is what your kids are consumed with from the time they enter adolescence until they enter adulthood. Every day, these are the issues to them. And until they solve these, nothing else really matters. Now, the timing of this is kind of interesting. The timing of it, remember I said you're dependent as a child, you're interdependent as an adult, and then you go through this process of trying to figure out how to insert yourself in adulthood. It begins with puberty. When your body changes, you look weird, and you get a bunch of hair and all that kind of stuff. And it ends when culture says, okay, you've landed, you've kind of settled now. You're ready for life or to be a high school football coach, perhaps. Okay. What's fascinating about this, it begins in puberty, and as it begins in puberty, it ends in culture. So on the puberty side, this is where being kind of, I didn't want to be a scholar, by the way. I think being a scholar is weird. You're on an airplane and say, what do you do for a living? And usually I don't want to talk to anybody, which is why God gave us headphones. But if I don't want to talk to them, I just tell them I'm an evangelist, and that shuts them up really fast. But if they, if I do feel like, well, it might be interesting, they may be interesting. I say I study adolescent development, family systems, marriage, young adults. That's the stuff I spend a lot of my time on. That's kind of an interesting thing. And what's interesting about this whole thing as a scholar studying puberty, I'm just going to let you in on something, that this is a weird thing. And when I had a couple of masters in theology, when I started teaching, it was at Denver Seminary. And after about 6 months, the dean, which is the equivalent of senior pastor, I guess, called me in and he said, have you started your doctorate yet? And I go, what are you talking about? He said, your PhD. Yeah, have you started your PhD? You're teaching master's students, you got a PhD. And I go, no, the program's going great. It's busy. You got all kinds of students. It's really going well. He goes, hey, in the interview, you said you would get a PhD. And I went, it's the interview. It's like dating. We're married now. It doesn't make any difference anymore whatsoever. That's not all that funny, I realize. So I drove down the street to the University of Denver, and I walk in the Office of Graduate Studies. She said, well, yeah, can I help you? Yeah, I need to get a PhD. Kind of like go to Walmart, need some fishing line. And she goes, in what? That was hysterical because what? What do you mean, in what? I had no idea. I said, it doesn't matter. They didn't tell me. Then she said, what'd you major in? And that was really a bummer because I went to the Harvard of the West. UC San Diego, the Mighty Tritons, maybe you've heard of them. La Jolla, California. Tritons, we won the Women's Division III Badminton Championship in 1975. Powerhouse. And had the best surf team in the NC2A surfing deal at the only nude beach in California. So it was an unbelievable experience. So I played guitar. I surfed every day, lived in Del Mar. I messed around Church and Young Life, had an incredibly great time. So, of course, I was a communication major. Just want to let you know. Like your kids, when I'm going to be a communication major, then you know what they're doing with their college dollars, right? So I said that. And she goes, oh, we have this amazing department. And you're going to learn all kind of stuff. And I did, man. They put me through the ringer for that dang thing. But I remember one particular professor in interpersonal knew I had this bent for development. So she goes, okay, I want you to figure out average age of puberty historically. That was kind of her assignment. So this is before the internet was a big deal. So I went into the basement of the library, and I got all these journal books and photocopied my brains out and went over stuff. And I realized there is no data for 50% of the population historically. Nothing. Zero. We know nothing about the average age of male puberty in any culture. Two reasons, I think. Guys lie and guys don't want to talk about it. I mean, those are the two things. But women, as you well know, the women go, yeah, yes, there's all kind of data. You go back 150 years ago, you can find a letter, the exact date of the first menses. Exact date for women, nothing for guys. You go back 500 years ago, you can find diary entries. 1,500 years, walls of caves. 7 to 70 million years ago, depending on your pastor's theological perspective. Dinosaur footprint. Guess what happened to Mary Ellen? There's a book about it even. Women celebrate this stuff. They never tell guys. And I discovered this, and it kind of grossed me out, frankly, like most of the men here. It's because it matters. You know why it matters? Is the average age of female puberty has an amazing relationship with its environment and has historically. We hardly ever talk about it or even know it. Women know this. No guy even knows this stuff. We went out to dinner, about a year and a half ago. We live in a place called Gig Harbor, Washington. Beautiful. It's kind of got this little harbor about a quarter-mile wide, mile deep. And then there's Mount Rainier, and there's this iconic restaurant called Tide's Tavern. It's just awesome. And they have this little kind of deck out there in the summer. It's great. You sit out there, and you order Presbyterian beverages. And so we're going to go out with this other couple, and it's really exciting. I hadn't eaten much. I was really excited to be with them. And as the guy walks in, the guy's about 6'6". People thought we were twins. And he walks in, just kind of his head down, just, some kind of fight in the car. Something happened. But his wife was so excited and really fired up. And as we sat down, she said, before we order, guess what happened to Haley this week? And goes into great detail with my wife, talking about it for a half an hour. And I'm kind of wanting to interrupt them, saying, appetizers? And the other guy's going, shut up, Chap. Just don't say anything. Just shut up. Don't say anything. Kicking me under the table. And they talked about it. Yay. They talked about this book called The Red Tent. I thought it was a Nebraska Cornhusker Booster Club thing. I had no idea. Maybe an A&M thing about Alabama. Anyway, I've been a guy most of my life. And not one time have I ever been out of mixed company. Not one time. And one of the guys saying, hey, before we order. You see where I'm going. Guess what happened? Guess what happened to Timmy this week? Let's talk about that. No, we don't talk about that. Just shut up. Well, what's really fascinating, and in American society, our academic structures are what are called siloed, meaning academic guilds read their own stuff and pretend like nobody else has anything to say. And whether the pejorative labeling of what are called hard sciences, and some of you may be very proud you're in the hard sciences, as opposed to those wimpy little soft sciences like sociology, cultural anthropology, psychology, development. But we don't read each other. We don't talk to each other. So in American culture, we don't hardly ever talk about this. But this is an amazing reality. Let me show you something historically. As we identified adolescence in around 1900, average age female puberty around that time was about 14 and a half. When were you an adult? We didn't really start studying it until the 20s or 30s, but from about then until now, we go back and know that you were an adult at about 16 in 1900. It was about a 2-year process of trying to figure out how to individuate identity, autonomy, and belonging. Let's jump to 1970, 1980. Average age female puberty was actually 13. That's when it dipped below 13 years old, dominant culture US. Started to go down. When were you an adult? Well, if you're somewhere between 35 and older, you were an adult somewhere between 18 and 20 years old on average. Now, some of you go, well, wait a minute. What do you mean you're an adult? Because we love saying that adults have these fixed numbers, right? Especially if you have little kids. You say you're an adult at 18. I love hearing people say, oh, you're an adult at 18. And you kind of go, you just talk to any parent that's a parent of a kid who's 18, 20, 37, and you kind of, maybe that's not all that accurate. But we have these numbers. 16, it's driving, right? Here in Texas, right? Driving. Okay, 18 is voting, military, chewing, tobacco products, unless you play Little League, then it's 9. Or live on a farm, and then it's 4. Okay? But then some of us kind of go to this. If you walked in here, we asked you to write down a number. A lot of you would say 21. You're an adult at 21. So you tell your kids you're an adult at 21. Oh, yeah, okay. So you can drink alcohol unless you live in Washington State, and you can now smoke pot legally. And any Methodists here? Awesome, huh? Okay, sorry, I was just kind of kidding. That was just a total joke, sort of. Okay, but yeah, you can drink alcohol because 21 is when you're a mature and adult. Interesting. But to Hertz and National Rent-A-Car, you're not an adult till 25. But to Southwest Airlines, you're an adult at 2. You ever seen that 5-year-old in pull-ups? Goo goo gaga to say their parents $150 to go to Fresno. What's interesting about all this is the arbitrary numbers we use for adulthood. And I hate to say this, but there's been studies done on this. And somewhere between 8 and 15, 18 states in the U.S., if you're Caucasian and commit a crime and you're 17, you're tried as a juvenile and you're in the juvenile system. If you're 12 and you're African American poor in these states, you're going to be tried as an adult, all things being equal. Isn't it interesting how we change the definition and the age in order to suit whatever is most convenient for us or what makes us feel better about ourselves? But the reality is becoming an adult cannot have a fixed number. Because becoming an adult means I've relatively landed on identity, autonomy, and belonging. I'm ready to be an interdependent peer. Yes, young adult, but a peer. And for those of you 35 and older, it's probably somewhere to 18 to 20 years old. And here's the problem is, we'll tell our kids, I totally get you. I get it. I understand. I was in high school. And then we say things like this. This is beautiful. High school is the best time of your life. I read that all the time, people saying stuff like that. Don't those stupid, spoiled, entitled kids realize that this is as good as it's ever going to get? Oh, what a gift. You tell that to a kid? Have you ever seen the look on their face? Well, usually they're so numb to it because they've heard it over and over and over. But anyone that's still kind of relatively fresh in terms of their thinking, they look at you like, okay, so you're saying that what I'm going through as a 16-year-old in this culture, that life is only going to get worse from here? That's pretty depressing. But then they look around the adult world. They look at the media, and they see all the kind of rhetoric that's out there, but the reality of how lives are lived. And they go, well, maybe this is as good as it gets. And wonder where they go from here. Okay, so then we jump to today. Where are we now? Average age female puberty, dominant culture, according to Center for Disease Control, is 12 years old. If you have the data in a calculator for Caucasian kids who are wealthy in the U.S., it's probably about 11.8 or 7. Doesn't matter. The silo that controls these numbers has said 12. But there's a whole lot of other data out there. One little data group, just to give you a tiny example of this, is that scholars that have studied the relationship between fathers and their daughters have discovered something that is not all that well studied, but what has been studied corroborates it across the board. It's very solid stuff. The girls that report a close relationship affectively, emotionally with their dads, on average, hit their first menses 6 months later than girls that report an estranged emotional relationship from their father. 6 months. That is huge. Statistically, that's almost unbelievable. Fathers, you're incredibly necessary, not just when they're little kids, but as they get older. The closer they feel to you has an impact. We don't understand the impact. We're not sure the causality, but there's something going on. And we don't need to debate this part of it because it's a fact. It's getting younger. Some people say it's labeled, it's kind of settled out. Don't tell Latinos in urban Los Angeles that because it's almost 10 something. Because you go to different populations and it's different. It can't just be hormones in the food supply because there's way too many other variables. The reality is, though, this is getting younger. I'm not a mathematician. You probably figured this out. But I've worked on this, and I just got to tell you, I've worked on it, and I'm scared to death on this one. This is scary. Maybe one of you guys, you have some resources. You may have a passion. Go get a PhD. Go to Rice, and figure this one out. Because by the year let's just do the math. Year 2034, girls are going to be born pregnant. Just the math alone. Jeez. It's not that funny if your daughter's 8. Sorry. Okay. When are you an adult now? This is not Chap's list. This is all the secular journal articles out there. Everything I'm telling you is based on the latest academic data. If you ever find out something that I said that's not based on data, please write me. Please tell somebody. Get in touch with a pastor or anybody that knows who I am, because I'm not trying to push any agenda. I'm simply trying to report what is really going on out there. What scholars say for women, it's mid to late 20s in order to individuate now. For men, mid to late 40s, that sucker goes on and on. Some of the guys going, that's not all that dang funny. Yes, I know. Have you ever watched TV or a movie? That kind of gives you a little hint. Here's what you need to see out of this. When we tell our kids, I understand, I get it. And this is painful for me too, because my 2 worst years were 7th grade. Absolutely true. Is today's 23-year-old is the developmental equivalent of a 17-year-old 25 years ago. That's what you have to know. Is when you have fixed numbers and your own experience that we transpose on kids in a wildly changing culture. We can let everything else change in culture. We can let a new stop sign come in, or corporate structures, or ideology, or TV shows, or you name it. We got to adapt to change. All of life is about change, and it's increasing, and it's becoming much more rapid. But we don't think that that's affected what it means to grow up. And that's where we're dead wrong. Is today's 23-year-old is about, if you're roughly 40 years old, and where you were as a junior in high school is where today's 23-year-old is, developmentally. And if you can get that in your head, that can help you to deal compassionately, relationally, strategically with your kids as they grow up. All that said, I usually like to talk about this in terms of stages because it helps people kind of understand what is going on with adolescence. With the left pole would be the pole of childhood, where you have the support of the family system, you're dependent. The right pole is the pole of the community when you're interdependent, all right? In between those two, by definition, adolescence is a tightrope. You and I went through it. For most of us in this room, it was about a 5 to 7 year period. It may not have been that easy, and some of you go, wow, no, man, my high school and early college area, that was such a great time for me. Fantastic. But that's because you've created a narrative around your experience. There's not a single person that goes through high school and young adulthood, the first couple of years out of high school, unscathed. Not a single person. Every single one of us has some wins and some losses, some great highs and some incredible lows. Sometimes when we were unbelievably lonely and felt deeply insecure, and other times we felt like we're on top of the world and we had good friends. Every single one of us. Yet as we grow up, we learn how to judge according to social hierarchy who's doing well and who's not. And as long as we can find our own equilibrium on that scale, then we can present ourselves as someone, I love high school, awesome, yearbook, 27 times. But we know the story. Here's a part of the problem. 25, 30 years ago, as we all were going through adolescence, it was hard for us. There was disappointment. There was wondering if we had any social capital. There's wondering if they only liked us because we were good at a sport or music or we're a good kid or a smart kid. But still we pressed on and we ended up making it to late adolescence. And then when you become an adult, what do you do with all the incongruity from adolescence? There's not a one of us that are not bruised. We learn how to defend, deflect, deny, head fake. What do? You can't go through life with random experience that doesn't have congruity to it. So what do? We create our own narratives around our life experiences so that we can make sense of them. It's as if you take all of the stuff from your high school experience and you dump it on the kitchen table and then you shove it into a shoebox, you put a top on it, get some duct tape, maybe a ribbon, depending on if it's basically a distant experience, and you write with a Sharpie on the outside of it, high school. Then you take that and you take it out to the garage of your soul and you stick it on the garage shelf of your soul. And somebody goes, how was high school? So when I say that to you, when you think of how was high school, you're thinking of the box. You peek into the garage of your soul. Oh yeah, there's the box with a ribbon on it. High school is great, the best time of your life. But if you actually open it up, put it on the kitchen table, this is where Facebook is dangerous when you hit 45, 50, 55 years old. Because you try to relive and relieve your experience from those days so easily. Because those feelings are incredibly fresh and right on the surface for us. Adolescence, by definition, is a solitary experience, and therefore it's painful. It's artificial. God never intended it. By scholars, it's called a social invention of modernity. It's an invention of the way we changed our life and how kids became less and less necessary, and so we gave them less and less social capital. And therefore, adolescence came onto the scene about 100 years ago. When we started studying, it was about the 30s until the mid-90s. This is what we knew. The movement from dependency as a child to interdependency, here's a word I haven't used yet, and this will throw some of you off. I have to become independent in order to become interdependent. If your kid graduates from high school without becoming relatively healthy in their own independence, their sense of self, their decision-making, their ability to communicate, their ability to say something and live with the ramifications of what they say, their ability to push back in a way that's civil, their ability to take in information but also wrestle with that and get back, engage in dialogue. See, that's all what it means to become independent. And you guys know. You know adults who have not quite achieved that independence. You know adults that are not really, you're not able to connect with. You can't be married in a healthy marriage. You can't have a good friendship. You can't be in the workplace unless you have individuated to the point where you truly are trustworthy as an independent peer, interdependent peer in adulthood. It's vital that our kids somehow become independent before they enter adulthood. Now, here's what we knew about this period from 1930s to the 90s. Here's basically the ages. Now, I want you to see something. See that right there, the 14 or 15? If you remember, average age puberty up until about 100 years ago, it looks like around the world, was about 14 or 15. This is also the time when the brain started to shift from concrete to abstract abilities. The brain is concrete as a child up until about 14 or 15, whereas they receive data, they store data, they process data, and they actually utilize data. That is very concrete up until the time they're 14 or 15. So here's what's interesting is puberty's gotten younger. Female puberty, it's the average age of female puberty. This is now around the world. Average age of female puberty is when all the boys and girls begin adolescence, asking those three questions. And here's how you understand an early adolescent. Basically, it's this. You have the brain of a child, but you have the body of an adult. That's early adolescence. And this is a time, another way to put it is, your feet are bigger than your parents, but you can't find your locker. Okay, does that one make sense to you? Now, what's interesting is this is the time in life when boys and girls are at their most different, even as adults. because all of this is kind of relatively fixed in a physiological process until the brain shifts. Right here, down, you're going to grow up to that point. These are fixed dates. Once you hit 14 or 15, you move into abstraction. All of life is socially regulated, psychosocially regulated. And that's when males and females, yes, have unique characteristics, some cultural, some created. But what's interesting about that period is our capacity for engaging others and how we do that. That's pretty universal. Because males and females were created in what? The image of God. God created humanity, and the Hebrew word for humanity is Adam. Ish and Ishtar, he created them. Male and female, he created them. That's the social experience we have as adults. So up until this point, right around here, see, boys and girls, the best thing to ever do in church is teach 3rd and 4th graders. You ever done that? Our 3rd and 4th graders are awesome because the boys and girls are very concrete. They're very relational. They're easy. They're fun. They can talk to each other. It's so incredibly great. Dads, your favorite time with your daughter is probably around 3rd or 4th grade. She'll wear the jersey. She'll wear the hat. She'll sit on the couch with you, high five, totally cheer, completely into it. Then she hits about 13, 12, 13 years old. 7th grade, she comes in. You're watching a game where she would always sit and watch. She sits down. Hi, Daddy. You say hi. She sits there for maybe 3 seconds. Finally, she goes, fine, and texts all her friends what a jerk you are. You didn't do anything wrong, you don't think, but you don't exactly know what happened. You kind of go like this. By the way, for dads, when your daughter hits 11 or 12 until they're about 25, this is your life. But during this period, Nancy Chodorow from Harvard, she claims that the 11 to 14-year-old female is the most relationally intuitive human on the planet. Relationally intuitive. Think of you're watching Discovery Channel, you are really bored, and there's this new thing, kind of organism that's beautiful they find in the depth of the Pacific Trench, with these 2 huge antennae. And that is an 11 to 14-year-old female, where these antennae are constantly going, whoa. And they're going really fast, and they're looking for one source of sustenance. They just want to know, do you like me? Approve of everything I've said? Do you feed me all the time how great I am? And this is where dads are completely clueless because they still think their daughter's in 4th grade, and all of a sudden they have these antenna, and their antenna are freaking out all the time. Interesting thing about this period is they just want to be liked, but their minds go at the speed of a Japanese, speed bullet train. Boys are very similar with one little difference. Their brains go at the speed of the little engine that never should have tried in the first place. Just think of, Shrek in 6th grade. They have antenna, girls' antenna, boys' antenna. Do this for fun. If you don't have a middle school boy at home, do this for fun. Go to a middle school. This is so much better than anything you see on TV or a movie. Go sit and watch. Don't get arrested. A middle school at the end of the day, because here's moms will pull up and they'll get there early if they have a son, because they want to make sure that son can find them. So they sit right in the front, right there. And the 7th grade boy, the day's over and he knows, I got to get my backpack and I got books. So he goes, and every book from his locker he puts in his backpack because he doesn't have any idea what kind of homework, but he just, oh man. And then any other open locker, he'll grab their books too, So watch the 6th and 7th grade boys walk out of school. And then it's so funny to watch these little boys kind of walk, and they walk out kind of like this. And there's a minivan or a Hummer, depending on your denomination, right there. And the mom or stepdad or parole officer, whoever responsible for the kid, is yelling, honey, right here, honey. And he's 10 feet away, and he's kind of going. Finally, he sees you. He goes up and he pulls out throws the backpack in there. And he goes, hi, honey. Hi. And he gets in the car and he's about to shut the door. And she goes, where's your shoe? And did I leave home with 2 shoes? I don't know. I don't know where my shoe is. Oh, I forgot my backpack. And he runs out of the car and the backpack's sitting right there. That's the 11 to 14-year-old male. Here's the thing you guys got to know as parents and other adults, you guys. During this period, early adolescence, when the average age of female menses hits is when it starts, And it ends when the brain begins to shift into abstraction. And here's the deal. For females, they have this amazing intuition, and they're constantly looking for cues because they're insecure. They're incredibly vulnerable, and they know it, but they don't know how to describe it because their brain's not abstract yet. So they express it in so many different ways. Don't be fooled by the 11 to 14-year-old girl. She is just wanting to be liked and embraced and cared for, and she has no idea what that means, and it changes every 3 seconds anyway. The boy has exactly the same needs. It takes him 2, maybe 3 years to actually figure out if you like him or not. But the idea for both of them is, I'm aware I'm on a tightrope, but I can't talk about it because I'm not really cognitively understanding it. Right? And then, for those of us who are 35 roughly and older, as the brain began to shift from concrete to abstract, it looks like for all of time, this was an almost immediate process. Now, there's probably going to be more and more debate about this because the brain studies have done good work on mature brains. And now we say that it takes the brain to move at least 10 years from the frontal to the basal lobe. That's the technical term for it. Okay? For the full nuancing, the full expression of abstract thought. And there are actually some that postulate, oh, that means real maturity as an adult doesn't happen until mid to late 20s for anybody. But that's because we have MRI technology now. We didn't have MRI technology 30 years ago because 30 years ago it probably was 18, not 25. How do we know this? Because you can go back in history, whether it's recent history 30 years ago, 50 years ago, and you can find examples of highly nuanced, abstract, fully mature adults at 21 years old, 50 years ago. But you can go back 200 years ago and see people who are 16, 17, 18 as fully mature adults. We were in Napa for research purposes a couple weeks ago, and it was a productive, trip. And there's a place there, one of the oldest wineries in Napa, that Francis Ford Coppola has taken back over, and it's called Inglenook, and it was one of the very first ones. It was started by a guy when he was 17 years old. He was commissioned to be the skipper of his warship, a major warship for Russia in their eastern side of their country, right around Alaska. When he was 19, he was the admiral of the fleet at 19 years old. By the time he was 21, he had already started a company with a whole bunch of other ship's captains that would go down to San Francisco and supply all the new people that are moving to Alaska. By the time he was 25, he's a multimillionaire using the dollars from the around 1900, 1880s, 1870s. This guy was a full, mature adult, productive adult at 17 years old. And you can go back and see that in antiquity. So abstraction didn't always have to take a while. There's a relationship to the environment and how quickly the brain matures. There's simply no question about that if you look at all the data. So up until the mid-90s, this is called late adolescence. See, this is early. You have the body of an adult and the brain of a child. Here, you have abstraction beginning to kick in. And in fact, the brain is very sophisticated in some ways for 15, 16, 17-year-olds. Unbelievably capable in some ways. And yet, socially, in terms of their integration in society and a lot of other things, that takes a much longer time to nuance a sense of self as it relates to the outside world. We call this late adolescence. Here's the definition of late adolescence. I am basically ready to be an adult. In fact, I know everything I need to know to be an adult. Remember when that was you? Remember when you were a senior in high school? Sure. I know everything. And in fact, the only thing that I need is you to pay for my parking tickets. Come on, get at it. I need $5,000 for the Europe trip next summer, but I'm a full adult. In other words, I'm fully adult on the terms that I want to be a fully adult, and I'm still a bonehead kid when I want you to resource my life. That's called late adolescence. Now, here's the interesting. You move from the mid-90s to mid-2000s, this thing started to really change, as we've seen. And what ended up happening is that's still fixed. That's where the brain begins to change. Now, roughly, we realize it takes about 10 years to become fully mature in terms of brain development. But you can't be 10 years of kind of getting it like a late adolescent. And here's where scholars started to write in the mid-90s a lot, calling this a third stage of adolescent development called mid or middle adolescence. Early is marked by concrete thinking and ability. Late is marked by abstract thinking and ability. Here's mid. So if you are dealing with a 14 to 20-year-old, okay, here's the definition of a mid-adolescence. Egocentric abstraction. I'm aware I impact others by my behavior and attitudes, but I don't care. Now, that sounds mean. That sounds pejorative. Sounds like I'm blaming kids. Well, you know what? Read the newspapers. Listen to the news magazines. Listen to other adults. Follow adults at your church or at a mall as they see kids, as they listen to kids interact. We got so many different ways to label kids and dismiss them, whether they're spoiled or they're entitled or they're selfish or they're disrespectful or they're disloyal. We got so many ways to blame kids for being kids. What I'm hoping you see is recognize that this period, egocentric abstraction means this. I have no idea who I am, identity. I have no idea what kind of power I have because it's all been external up till now. And I have no idea who cares about me. Therefore, I'm going to spend all my energy in self-protection. That's what's going on. We blame kids for the world we've handed kids, and we blame them. Egocentric abstraction. It's where I am so consumed with myself. If you've been around a 14 to 20-year-old on average, it doesn't have to be 20. It might be 19. It might even be 18. But it might be 23 and 25 for mid-adolescence as well. There's no fixed number here. This is just an average. But this is a period where someone says, I literally have to watch out for me. And how kids described it, and this is a big part of my research, is literally they're in survival mode during this period. Because they really don't know where they fit, who they are, or what kind of power they have. Now, that said, there's some brain researchers that are recognizing that they got to get this down into the populace. If you think of the teenage brain as a car, this is Alison Gopnik in Wall Street Journal this year. Today's adolescents acquire an accelerator a long time before they can steer and brake. That's how you think of them. They know how to push the pedal to the metal, but they really don't understand the need or have the ability to steer and brake. And actually, for the last 5 to 7 years, J.J. Arnett and others, he's a developmental psychologist in the East, they've actually named a fourth stage of life, calling it emerging adulthood. That it's much more difficult to become an adult. That's actually the new projects. I've written a whole bunch of stuff. You probably didn't know that. That's okay. But I'm working on actually 2 book projects now. One with a guy that's been a CEO of a couple of different companies, and another guy that's a financial guru type guy. And we're writing books on how do you understand and work with millennials. Because the 20 to 35-year-old, hardly anybody understands them. They're still just trying to figure it out in their adulthood. Now, all that said, why has this happened? Why is adolescence lengthened? Why have our kids experienced this? Why is there egocentric abstraction? Why do so many adults not understand or even like kids? And it seems to me it comes down to this. Society's response to kids. I'm going to use something that I know in Texas is not a big issue. I want to remind you, it's an exponential loss of social capital from those who are necessary in the lives of our kids. That's what's gone on. That's why adolescents started in the first place, and that's what's been happening. That's the first Little League team. I know sports are not a big deal here, so especially UT. Sorry. Good. How's Rice doing? Have they won? No? They haven't won one? Not one? 3! Way to go. Good thing for Louisiana Lafayette. Okay, good. Sorry. Look at that kid. This is 1937. That kid's got a bat. He's very excited he's got the bat. That girl's got the ball. She's very excited. They had girls and boys on the team, anywhere from 7 to 16 years old. They let that little boy wear a dress. They're very progressive back then. Now, there's a lot you can see in this. I do a doctoral seminar. We spent almost a whole morning just on this picture and related things. But here's the one thing I want you to notice. There's no adult in the picture. In 1937, somebody had this idea that baseball is important. It's, after all, our national pastime, rhetoric of meta-narrative. It's how we play together, how we enjoy each other. And therefore, he decided to institute something called youth sports, named it Little League. You can't go back into that town and find a plaque or find a picture that says, "Thank you, Susie, for Susie's Cafe sponsoring this." There's no adult getting any credit at all for doing the nice thing of helping kids have a baseball experience. That's where youth sports started. The original intent was to support kids and to help them to grow into adulthood. Where are we now with Little League?
Okay, keep your eye on the ball, Brandon. Come on, big fella. Base hit. Here we go now. Oh, that's a base hit. Nice job, Brandon. Nice job. Way to go, Brandon.
Mike must be so proud of your son. He's having a great season.
Oh, thanks, Kathy. But hey, your son Jason, he's got a great arm. He's going to be on we'll see him at Dodger Stadium soon.
Yeah, Mike, I mean, Brandon is really stinging the ball this summer.
Well, if his math scores were as high as his batting average, I'd have a straight A student. Okay, Brandon, you don't want to get picked off. Get on the bag.
You know, I haven't seen Heidi in a while. Will you make sure to say hello for me?
I certainly will. Thanks. She's actually real busy with her career, shopping.
I think my wife's in the same line of work.
Oh. No outs, Brandon. Get on the bag. So, Kathy, how's the art gallery going?
Pretty well, actually. We just started carrying this terrific sculptor from Costa Mesa.
Oh. Get on the bag.
Yeah, he works in iron and marble.
Oh, wow, that sounds interesting. I love art myself.
Get on the bag!
Well, we're having an exhibit this Wednesday. You should all pop by.
Oh, okay.
You know, my wife and I went to the L.A. County Museum of Art and saw the Van Gogh retrospective. Brandon! Get on the damn bag! His early sketch work is really appealing.
Hey, Brandon, maybe you should listen to your dad and stay close to first base, partner.
Yeah.
You know, what I always tell my son Nathan, just go out there and try to have fun, you know.
Well, you know, having fun is the name of the game. Hey, son! You trying to make an ass of me? Get on the bag!
Okay, that's plenty. Some of you may be put off or upset by the two swear words. But if those bother you more than the brilliance of the sketch, we got a problem. When did we first allow adults to shame kids as kids play a sport in order to learn how to be on a team and to enjoy using their body and to experience the celebration of sport? When did we first say that was okay? It's so commonplace and has been for a long time now. I kind of want to, if in heaven it has all these, old DVDs like at fishing lodges and stuff like that, I kind of want to see the DVD of the first Little League coach that decided it was appropriate to wear a baseball uniform to the Little League game. The first guy, not the people at Starbucks now with the black eye stuff and everybody that coaches now. It's so normal. But who was the first one to go, I got this great idea. Instead of wearing jeans and my own T-shirt, I'm going to dress up like a baseball player because the managers do it. What? I would just love to know, when did sport become about us? Are you trying to make a fool of me? How can a child's performance in sport, and we're talking child, we're not talking high school. How can a child's performance in sport or music or dance or drama, any extracurricular activity that was originally designed when it first got instituted decades ago, was for the best and health of that kid? That was a gift to that kid so they could become interdependent as adults, so that we as adults said, you matter enough that we're going to give you these opportunities. It's not going to be about us. We never shame you. We're going to walk with you. But something shifted. Then we got education. Interesting about education is in 1900, 1% of high school eligible kids went to high school. There's conflicting stories out there, especially in textbooks. But the reality is, in 1900, 1% of high school eligible kids went to what we now know as a high school. Not a prep school, but a high school. By the 30s, high school became mandatory for all kids in every state. Something shifted. Well, right around that time, remember I said adolescence? We identified adolescence right around 1880 to 1900. We also identified that kids were not done after elementary school, which finished at 8th grade. See, primary school went from kindergarten or first grade to 8th grade. Then you were done. And 1% went on to this, what we typically call high school, but we realized that our kids were not ready for adulthood. In fact, let me show you something. This comes from the Horace Mann and Public Schools in the United States Pioneers in Education report in 1907. Take a look at this. Successive generations of mankind taken collectively constitute one great community. 1907. All the wealth which this community possesses it owes to all its children with a view to providing them with an education adequate to protect them from poverty and vice and prepare them worthily to perform their civic and social duties. The successive holders of this wealth are merely its trustees. That's us. Bound by the most sacred obligations to execute their mandate faithfully. And to divert this wealth from its true object, the education of the young, is a great crime, indeed a greater one than similar breach of faith with contemporaries. See, 100 years ago, kids were considered so incredibly valuable that we're going to give them amazing education. We're going to give them the best we have to offer. Not some kids, not just those kids that are better than others, not just those kids that are our brightest and our best, but we've even hijacked two highly important developmental words that are theological words, and yet we've gone with it. And usually those of us that go with it are because our kids happen to fit into these categories. Gifted and talented programs in the 70s and beyond. When we say that 15% of a school are gifted and talented, by definition, we are saying the other 85% are not. And nobody thought that way in 1907. And yet we've become so used to bifurcating kids and fragmenting kids and segmenting kids and building a social and academic hierarchy where we try to do the best we can, but it's become not only untenable economically, even though in those days it didn't matter. In the 30s is when we built most of the high schools in the U.S. first time around, was during the Depression. And yet something kind of shifted. Where are we now with education?
Hello, you've reached the automated answering service of your school. In order to assist you in connecting to the right staff member, please listen to all options before making your selection. To lie about why your child is absent, press 1. To make excuses for why your child did not do his homework, press 2. To complain about what we do, press 3. To cuss out staff members, press 4. To ask why you didn't get needed information that was already enclosed in your newsletter and several bulletins mailed to you, press 5. If you want us to raise your child, press 6. If you want to reach out and touch, slap, or hit someone, press 7. To request another teacher for the 3rd time this year, press 8. To complain about bus transportation, press 9. To complain about school lunches, press 0.
Here's the key.
If you realize this is the real world and your child must be accountable for his or her own behavior, classwork, homework, and it's not the teacher's fault for your child or children's lack of effort, thank you and have a nice day.
Now, teachers love that, and educators love that. And when I get a chance to talk to them, it's like finally somebody's recognizing how ridiculous it's gotten for us. I am not blaming teachers. Usually we have to look for somebody to blame. I'm not blaming coaches. I'm not blaming music teachers or dance teachers. That's not the point. I'm inviting you to get into a helicopter and go 1,000 feet and do what's called a macro analysis of the world that we've handed our kids. We have systemically abandoned them. Not systematically. That implies kind of a proactive, deliberate response in order to hurt them. Nobody's doing that. Most coaches are great. Most teachers are fantastic. But the problem is the systems themselves have fostered such an adult-oriented expectation that kids are invited into relationship with us and are blessed when and if they perform or conform according to the agendas we lay before them. And every kid knows from the time they're a little tiny child, their whole life is jumping from expectation box to expectation box, hoping that some adult will say, blessed are you, until you miss the extra point. Like a young friend, when I was doing this research project, did when he was a junior in high school. One of the best athletes in the school, he missed an extra point. They lost the game, and the dad completely flipped out as the other dad shunned him because this was a school where the fathers would love to high-five each other when a kid made a tackle, as if they had anything to do with it, especially the shape most of them were in. That the parents, that the coaches, that the boards so easily have grabbed back what originally was for the best of kids. And I'm saying we did this without a deliberate intention. But that's the world our kids have grown up in, a world of performance, conformity, and image. Denise Clark Pope from Stanford University wrote this great book called Doing School. Instead of fostering in students traits of honesty, integrity, cooperation, respect, the school may be promoting deception, hostility, and anxiety. See, in the late 80s, mid 80s, there was a lot of people worried about the state of kids. Some of you may have remembered that. Educators and therapists and youth workers and some folks knew about that during those days. So we're trying to figure out what was going on with kids. All the major risk factors were kind of jumping off the charts. Families were falling apart, more and more drug and alcohol abuse, more and more sexuality experienced, more and more suicide attempts, a lot of kids playing hockey, some really serious things. And so they commissioned a blue ribbon panel to study why are our young people struggling so much compared to just 20 years ago. So they analyzed measurable events and experiences from the early 60s to the mid 80s. And here's what they discovered. They had two basic discoveries. One is the skills needed for successful adulthood had risen exponentially during that time. The second was the ongoing adult support and guidance offered, social capital, had decreased at the same rate. Then they put these together, and they realized somewhere around the early 70s, we had crossed a line where no longer were we giving enough social support without an agenda to help a kid figure out how to become interdependent. We had abandoned our kids, and they had a much more difficult time, roughly around the early 70s, to individuate and enter adulthood. And that's when adolescence started to really lengthen. James Comer from Yale University says this: these two trends have created a serious problem in our country, indeed a crisis. But almost nobody knows about this study. It got no play because it blamed us for kids. Nobody wanted to hear that. We want to blame the kids. It's easier. We want to blame teachers. We want to blame the media. We want to blame everything except for our own systems that we actually can do something about. I just kind of invite you to consider this. This was 1989, so we're talking a long time ago, 23 years ago. I don't know how about you guys, but do you think that the skills needed for successful adulthood have risen or gone down since 1989? Obviously it's risen. I can't remember my passwords. Are you kidding me? I need a tutor just to tell me what my dang passwords are. What about the adult support? See, in the 80s, if three girls who were sophomores in high school went up to one of their English teacher they liked and said, will you come watch our volleyball game? She'd probably say yes. Because teachers, up until somewhere around the 80s, when regulations and economics and class sizes and all the politicization made it more and more difficult for teachers to actually spend time with kids outside of the actual classroom. See, now teachers teach English, but it used to be for decades teachers taught kids using the tool of English. Because the point was to socialize them, to help them to become productive members of society, not data transmission so they do well on a test. The point was to partner with parents and educators and communities and churches to say these kids matter, not some of them, but all of them. Interesting thing is, as this has changed, that teacher may have gone, and this is a day and age when a JV volleyball game was about the worst experience you could go through. Because that's before they changed the rules. Remember the old rules in volleyball? You couldn't get a point unless you served. Remember that? So JV volleyball games would take 2 or 3 days. I mean, net, oh, shoot, go. Okay, net, oh, you're all right, honey, sorry. So that poor teacher sitting up there for hours was watching, and she didn't have a cell phone to distract her like we do at dinner. What's interesting about this is she would also wait, and after the game, the 3 girls would sit up in the stands, and they'd talk about guys and family and future and hopes and dreams, and she would share life with them because that was okay to do in the 60s, maybe even early 70s. But for a lot of reasons, those things are just wasted away, whether it's sports or education or just about anything. There's simply nobody home for our kids. And even as parents, it's possible we contributed systemic abandonment and an exponential loss of social capital. At this point, I just have to tell you that 2 things. One is, I'm a social scientist, and I looked at and I did an analysis of every single man that walked in this room today. It's a gift. And I'm the best dad here. And I suck. Because when my oldest son, I was starkly aware of this, and the hundreds of times my kids have reminded me since, but my oldest son was created by God to be a soccer player. So when he joined the requisite soccer team, we lived in Denver. And in Denver, if you live in suburbia, your kid has to play soccer starting at 4 years old, 2 seasons every year, fall, spring. And he happened to score a goal every single game. So the first one, he loves McDonald's milkshakes. We're driving back, and he scored a goal. I'm going to buy a milkshake. Woohoo! Next week, he scored a goal. I'm going to buy a milkshake. And it became kind of normal. His younger brother was 3 years younger, was not created by God to be a soccer player at that time. Now, he's given me permission to tell this as long as I tell you that he played varsity football and did well. Okay, that's the deal. In high school. But then he, 4 years old, he never touched the ball. 5 years old, spring, never touched the ball. Fall, 5 years old, never touched the ball. This is now his 4th season. He's 6 years old, and it's the last game. The coach goes, let's get Rob a goal. Yay, Rob. They get all excited and go for it. Yay, Rob. So the whole game goes on. They're trying to get Rob the ball, but he's strategically avoiding it. And finally, about a minute to go, some mom goes, yeah, give it to Rob. And then another mom goes, where's Rob? And somebody goes, over there. And we all look. And there he is, the other end of the field, holding the hands of an opposing player, looking at a flower. That's who he was. He's still got a little bit of that in him now, 27. He's a youth pastor. He's a good one. But old Rob, we're driving home, and, I did the stupid dad stuff. You can't win them all. And it was fun to be on the team. And, Rudy had a good time. Guys, don't ever call any kid ever Rudy, because eventually he's going to see the movie and realize you're saying, you are awful. No business being here, but you got heart. Oh, thanks, Coach. That's awesome. Thanks, Dad. So I said all these dumb things about next year. So we're going to drive by McDonald's, and sure enough, big old alligator tear came down as we're driving by on our way home. And I looked at him and I go, oh, Rob, you're going to get a goal next year. I know it. Don't even worry about it. He said, that's not it. I'll never get a milkshake on Dad. I love that. That's exactly the reaction that's appropriate. The women all go, oh. All the men go, wimp. What the heck's wrong with you? He needs to learn the winners and losers. Come on. He stinks. He ought to know it. By the time you're 6, you ought to realize if you're no good, might as well just quit trying. And somebody asked me recently, did you buy him the milkshake? I said, yes, I bought him the milkshake. I made him pay for it. But the families of the 40s and 50s is under great attack in the secular world today. People say all the time that the family of the 40s and 50s is just as messed up as the family today. And there's a whole lot of different demographics and racial and economic issues. Aside from all that, in a helicopter 1,000 feet, I don't think the data actually supports that. But from a kid's perspective, you ask a 3rd grader 40 years ago to draw the family tree, they're going to draw something like this. This is not meant to be humorous. It's meant to be descriptive. You ask a 4th grader to draw their family tree today, 3rd grader, they're going to have to draw something like this in most cases. And here's the problem. Even a kid from that family has grown up in a world where they believe that the family is as stable as this. Because they've been taught, kid, nothing's stable. People have to take care of themselves. There's a lot of kind of weird stuff that happens, and you need to roll with it. We've even labeled something that is, in my opinion, and there's a few others that share this, that's about the worst thing we can possibly say. Is it children are resilient? They get over stuff. I'm sure most of you have heard that. The resiliency literature, however, is so short-term and such awful, god-awful research. Nobody gets over trauma that they've experienced, and you only define trauma from the self. What's traumatic to another person may not be traumatic to me, but what's traumatic to me is trauma. And the brain stores trauma. It does not go away. We don't get over it. Relational trauma, physical trauma, emotional trauma. It pops up at some point later when we become more abstract. But our kids are raised in a culture. 40 years ago, you would never hear a kindergarten kid when parents get in a little minor fight. They're just going to go with it. But you ask now, kindergarten kid hearing their parents in a minor fight, are you guys getting divorced? You'd never have heard that 40 years ago. It wouldn't cross their mind because this was their stable home. This was the anchor that held them together. I'm not trying to make any of us feel bad, but you guys, we got to get in a helicopter and be honest about what's going on with kids. And here's what happens. And I've been a part of this too. I've made so many mistakes as a dad. I'm married to a marriage and family therapist who actually uses horses for therapy. Her organization is called healingrange.com. If you want to check it out, it's absolutely awesome. And Dee is brilliant, and she's great. And the kids would go, yeah, mom was perfect, and you barely got a B minus, C plus if you're lucky. So often with my own kids, I contributed to systemic abandonment. But there's a bigger issue for families. This comes from the best documentary ever done on middle school kids. You can't buy it. You can only get it from HBO. They show it on HBO Family about once a quarter. It's a little dated. It's about 10 years old, but it's outstanding. Here's what they show in this one vignette. 11-year-old boy who is on medication because he's depressed. So a child, maybe early adolescent, who's been diagnosed as the problem, and typically that's called the identified patient, actually. But this particular kid is on medication for depression, and they're having a lot of family problems. They invite the filmmakers in to show them the father, the child, the mom. What I want you to see is how the mom and the dad, especially the dad, expect the child to participate in the family. Watch the behavior of the dad with an 11-year-old son who's an early adolescent on medication. Take a look at this.
Casey, I don't like having to be a cop. I don't like having a kid who lies to me, deceives me constantly. I would love to be able to trust you, but you're not trustworthy, and so I am going to do everything I can.
Going, Dad.
We want you to behave. And I'm spending so much time being the disciplinarian that I don't have the quality time I wanted, going out and throwing a football, things like that, because he is so oppositional. I took you skiing a bunch this winter. And
skiing, that's all you ever want to do. That's because that's all you like doing. And it's not because of me, it's because you like doing it. When have we ever been companions, Dad? Never. Not since maybe I was 4. Because you're always too busy with your new job. Mm-hmm. I mean, you even have Saturdays off now, and yet you still don't do anything. You have more time off than ever, and yet you never want to do anything.
Because you've been so difficult to be with, and that would you let me finish? And I am having to spend. You're interrupting me. You're interrupting, and it's really taken the fun out of being a parent for me. I used to enjoy your companionship plenty. You're a very interesting kid.
What's making you sad, honey? Put words to your tears. What's making you sad?
When he's there for me, I'm not there for him. And when I'm there for him, he's not there for me.
You get a chance to see this on HBO Family, I encourage you to. But there's so much there. Did you notice that he attempted to deal with his kid on a logical, adult peer-to-peer basis? An 11-year-old on medication for depression doesn't make any sense when he tries to share feelings. He doesn't know how to put the words together. He's very concrete. He didn't make a lot of sense. But the father had these massive expectations of his kid. And his primary one was kind of brought out there. It's the kid's job to make the family stable. It's the kid's job to make parenting fun. It's the kid's job to stay the course and not cause a hassle. Folks, I can't stress this more enough to say to you that every behavior, every attitude, every experience comes from some place. It may not come from your family system interaction. It may come from a chemical imbalance. There may need to be medication. It may come from a kid's own kind of how his body is moving into adolescence. It may come because of a pain a kid feels that they can't even recognize it. It may come from a kid's own anxiety. But the point is, it's so difficult to grow up in this culture. And when parents seem to try to ignore that and push aside the reality of what it means to grow up today, from the time you're 3, 4, 5 years old, everything's evaluated, everything's graded. You are constantly on on your toes. That when parents try to also say, that all stuff's fine, but you need to step up, kid. They have no safe place. Simply to be. And I realize it's hard. So many of us at different times in our lives, and this has happened in our family, where, you can get so disappointed, you can get so exasperated, you get so frustrated. There's rebellion, there's disrespect, there's behavior, there's attitudes. But it all comes from a place, and that place is trying to figure out, who am I? Do I have any voice and power? And does anybody care? How am I going to make sense of this crazy world? And I got nobody. And that's how every kid feels. They're not aware of it till they hit about 15, 16, 17. And that's when they try to figure out how they're going to cope with it in their social relationships. Ron Taffel wrote a great book called Childhood Unbound. He says this: regardless of headlines labeling us helicopter dads or soccer moms, in many ways parents seem almost invisibly removed. 21st century parent managers negotiating every single logistical challenge of their kids' cramped schedules became too frenetically busy to be a magnetic presence in the internal landscape of a child's world. Magnetic presence in the internal landscape of your kid's world. Nobody told us this when we had kids. How difficult it could be. How one kid could grow up and it could be just a piece of cake and marvelous. Cough syrup every night for the entire journey, and they're just fine. And then the next one comes up and, they're a Democrat. Sorry, I figured I was safe there. Okay. Most of you didn't know that I've written it, and I've written about it. You can look at them. There's actually parenting.com if you want to see some of the things that we've written or get hold of it. You guys have heard 2.0, I guess. That's the research project I did on kids. But Dee and I actually have a book on parenting. But most of you recognize me probably immediately because I started my literary career as a cover model. That's kind of where it began for me. Just real or Photoshop. I'm not telling. Okay. In the book, Hurt 2.0, it first came out, Hurt, first version, was a nationwide study of the attitudes and the perspective of kids on how they've grown up in this world of mostly late adolescence or early mid-adolescence. But here are some of the things. By the time they hit abstraction, 14 or 15, they become aware how vulnerable they are. So when your kid hits about 14 or 15, they grab onto each other and they go into the world beneath. They create their own social world, their own structure to self-protect. As they do that, though, they don't have a core self, and they got to be different people because they go into English and they got to figure out, how am I going to survive English? So they create a self for the English class. Then they go out of that and they go into math, and they create a different identity for math. Then they have a different identity for sport, for church, for young life, for home. Multiple selves because they don't have a core self. Now, most of us think, well, we all do that. No, we wear masks and we compartmentalize. That's very, very different. Your kid is constantly trying to negotiate various roles by presenting different selves. They are authentically them in each self, but not fully them in each self. And that's a big one for you to realize, because most of us will say to our kids, be yourself. And a kid goes, do you have any idea what this means? When I did this research project, I was on a high school campus for 8 months as a substitute teacher. That's how I got access to kids. Half the class I'd teach, and half the class I would just listen to them and interact with them. It was an amazing experience. Then did focus groups around the country, about 17 of them, and had a research team reading the literature out there. So that's kind of the research protocol. I got over 1,000 poems, letters, notes, and songs from kids when I was there at the high school. I don't know why, but they seemed to trust me rather quickly. In fact, one guy said about 2 weeks into it, I was there 8 months, he goes, you know why kids like to talk to you? I said, why? Because you're the only adult that doesn't have a hammer. I asked, what do you mean? You can't hurt us. We don't think you want to hurt us, but you can't hurt us. You got no power to hurt us. So we're going to tell you the truth. Over 1,000 poems, letters, notes, songs from kids, most of them anonymous. Our team coded these. 70% of them were about this question. Everybody expects me to be somebody, but I have no idea who that is. My parents want me to be the athlete, the student, the nice kid, the church kid. And those are fine. And most of your kids probably actually buy into that stuff. Here's the problem. The more they buy into it, they sacrifice their own developmental journey. The more we control our expectations of who they are and how they live their life, the less they're able to actually explore who they truly are and discover that person. And that's daunting. Because our kids at the best schools, at the most elite schools, are at greater risk than kids at the Midland colleges. Because the kids that are our best, our smartest, our best athletes, our student body officers, our spiritual kids, our student body leaders in our churches and organizations, these are great kids. But they've learned how to be great because they got great selves that adults feed and affirm. It's a lot like Gladwell's book, Outliers. The more they're successful at something, then they get more praise, and so they realize that's the best way to get more praise, is to be more successful. And so we really got to be worrying not just about our at-risk kids or our kids that are struggling. We got to be worrying about our kids that are the superstars. Because somewhere deep inside, they're still struggling with egocentric abstraction and wondering, does anybody care about me? I am one bad grade. I'm one stupid decision. I'm one too many beers at a party, and the whole house of cards had come crashing down. But if I get in the right school, if I get the right grades, if I don't cause problems, then everybody's going to tell me I'm a great kid. And therefore, we have much higher incidences of drug abuse, alcohol abuse, intentional alcohol abuse and addiction, of cutting and self-injury, of suicide attempts, of depression at elite schools with our freshmen and sophomores than we do at our public schools. Successful kids really learn how to adapt. In fact, this was Denise Clark Pope again in the Doing School. Successful students learn to devise strategies, various strategies to stay ahead of their peers and to please those in power positions. Unsuccessful students, for a variety of reasons, were not as adept at playing the survival game. And then Madeline Levine studies wealthy kids, kids of power. She says this in her book, The Price of Privilege. Why are children of privilege in record numbers having an extraordinarily difficult time completing the most fundamental task of adolescence, the development of internal autonomy and a healthy sense of self? Trust me, gang, you would much rather have your kid push back and wrestle while they're still at home than keep that facade going until they end up in college. Because at least they have the support of people that care and are going to help them to figure these things out as they move along their journey. And then even peers and friendships have changed. Most of us had what we call cliques, where we'd circle up and link arms and really care about our friends and had good friends, and we had some boundaries around that. That's adult and late adolescent behavior. But see, when you're an egocentric, abstract person, you are so on the run, so committed to survival, so committed to not being found out, that your friends mean everything because they're not really friendships. They're networks of mutual self-protection. Let me say that again. They're networks of mutual self-protection. They still link arms with their friends. And their friends even mean more to them now than they did 25, 30 years ago. But they link arms back to back now, like circle the wagons. The concept of wingman is the idea of self-protection and this network. That's why kids will say to you, you don't even know me. The only people that know me are my friends, right? And most moms will pastorally reply, what? Did your friends have an epidural? Oh, thanks, Mom, for giving me birth and life. Make me cookies and we'll be good. All right, thanks very much. The problem is they're clusters because they're not true, authentic friendships. Why you can't have a true, authentic friendship until you have a core self to give. Your kids will say these friends mean everything, but they also know their rules to their friendships. Because the point is mutual self-protection, therefore you can't talk about depression or loneliness or insecurity or family issues because you can't bring the rest of the cluster down. So kids are more lonely than ever before, even though they rely on their friends as much or more than ever before. More freedoms, more danger, whether it's sexuality or alcohol or drugs or, even becoming Raider fans. Just awful stuff. See, we blame the kids. We got to quit that. In fact, David Elkind, great writer, his book, The Hurried Child, people who are stressed or, in a word, egocentric, though not necessarily conceited or prideful, they have little opportunity to consider the needs and interests of others. Our kids are not entitled. They display entitlement. Our kids are not spoiled. They display a style of expecting everything. Our kids are not really disrespectful. They've been hurt and wounded because they have been disrespected. They haven't been given voice. They haven't been given options. They haven't been given the ability to wrestle with things and even fail a little bit because we squeeze them so tightly in everything they're involved in. This is the most stressed generation in history. These are quotes from kids. The pressure causes you to put on a good face. You can't be weak. You become one of those kids. So much pressure to succeed. Teachers expect me to be perfect. Kids that aren't in the excellent group feel like they're nothing. You have to bring your A game every day. This is the most stressed generation in history. You can look at the objective realities of the things kids are facing, the lack of social capital, the lack of adults who even know their names, much less their stories. After doing one of these things, I had a guy come up and he goes, "This is so good. I'm just going to get a bunch of adults in my kid's life because I'm going to get men in my son's life to speak truth into his life." Your kids don't need a single other person to speak anything into their life. They've heard every speech thousands of times. They need the blessings of presence and touch, of someone who listens and understands and comes alongside, as opposed to more people speaking principles and truth so that the kids have to jump through one more box and hoop. So what do? I have no idea. Let's close in prayer. It's been great for you to be here. Some of you are looking at your watch and you realize we got about 9 minutes to go. That's intentional, believe it or not. Mostly because the more you're aware of the problem, the easier fix becomes obvious. If the problem's lack of social capital, that's what we need to do. The book called Disconnected, Parenting Teens in a MySpace World. This was published 3 days before Facebook slaughtered MySpace. Praise the Lord for publishers. This you can get on Amazon. It's by Baker. And where Dee and I have taken and given a whole lot of ideas on how to deal with kids.